what I'm hoping to do is have us look at, really continue to look at this notion of the practical implementation of all these ideas. And I think you ended up getting a lot of great stuff just in the past hour from Doug in terms of practical tools and practical principles. So I'm just going to kind of keep us on that same trajectory. I want to talk about sort of three big tasks that I think we need to do in our churches to really flesh out, to really make real. We're talking today about how to encourage all of our people to really live out this whole life discipleship, how to really live missionally in their daily work lives, working in and through their regular jobs. We're talking about, to put another phrase on it, what I call vocational stewardship, which I'll define in just a few minutes. And as we try to equip our people for living out everything we've been talking about today, I think there's three tasks. And I would call the first the task of inspiration, and the second has to do with discovery, and the third has to do with what I'll call formation. Are you having trouble hearing me? I'm noticing that the sound is kind of going in and out. Should I be a little louder? Does that help? Okay. All right, so if we're going to actually equip people to turn out to be like the folks on the panel, everybody from Mike on the one end, a business owner with such an amazing, really multi-layered understanding of how to live out his faith, all the way down to our young panelist, Jason, on the end, and his really thoughtful remarks, thinking about what it means to be a Christian artist. If that's the goal, what we need to do, I think, are these three things. With regard to the task of inspiration, I think basically what it's about is lifting up people to understand the high calling of their work. We've got to help people whether they're getting in the pickup truck on Monday morning, whether they're heading to cubicle land, whether they are going into a nonprofit organization, heading into the elementary school like Eileen. We need to help them really have a sense that their work really does matter, that it's not a waste. Doug was telling us that so many people just feel like their job is just a waste. We have to really help them get inspired to understand that their work connects to God's work in the world, because God is actively at work in the world. We are not a bunch of deists. We don't believe that God sort of made the world and then he's up there playing golf, kind of, ignoring everything. We actually believe that God is hands-on, involved. He's doing his work of providentially sustaining and caring for and preserving the good world that he made. He's doing his work through common grace of restraining evil and corruption. As bad as the world is, my goodness, it would be a whole lot worse if God was not actively holding back. And God is at work renewing all things. We believe in the grand biblical story that goes from creation to fall to redemption to consummation. And we actually believe that King Jesus is on a mission of inaugurating the kingdom of God. It is now as well as not yet. And that the mission of God is alive and active in the world. And we are moving towards the New Jerusalem. We are moving towards the consummation of redemptive history, when all things will be made new in the new heaven and the new earth. God is on this amazing cosmic mission, the Missio Dei. And we need to inspire people to believe this sentence, which I love from my good friend Steve Garber. We need to inspire people to believe that vocation is integral, not incidental, to the Missio Dei. It is integral, not incidental, to the mission of God in the world. So how are we going to help them do that? Well, we need to help them understand how their work connects to God's work, how it connects to this mission in the world. So I was getting a little carried away here as I made my PowerPoint trying to do fancy things. All of redemptive history is moving towards the time when we will all live forever in the new heaven and the new earth. And we don't know precisely and exactly what life in the New Jerusalem is going to look like. But the Lord, in his graciousness and wisdom, has put lots of scriptures into the holy book that give us little preview pictures, that give us little glimpses about what life in the new heaven and the new earth is going to look like. I'm thinking about the kinds of passages that often seem to come up at Advent time. You know, you read about the lion lying down with the lamb and the child playing safely at the hole of the viper. I'm thinking about texts like Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 65 and Psalm 72 and Amos 3 and Revelation 21 and 22 and all these other passages that what they do is they begin to tell us what life is going to look like in the new heaven and the new earth. And it's going to be marked by these sorts of virtues. It's going to be marked by perfect justice, by beauty, by hope, by intimacy with God, by incredibly deep and rich community. It's going to be marked by safety and security. We will lie down in safety, it says in Ezekiel 34. And no one will make us afraid. Is that a beautiful picture after yesterday? Isn't it going to be wonderful when we're living in a place where no one will ever make us afraid again? This is what life in the new heaven and the new earth is going to look like. And I believe that one of the ways to really understand the mission of Jesus in the world, not the only way by any means, there's lots of different ways we could talk about the mission of Jesus in the world, but one way we could talk about it is to say that Jesus' ministry was a ministry of reaching into the future, fully consummated kingdom of God and yanking a foretaste of it back into the present. So, for example, we could look at his miracles. We could say, you know, it's kind of like he said to blind Bartimaeus, you know, Bartimaeus, in the new heaven and the new earth, there's not going to be any blindness. So I want to give you a foretaste of that today. I want you to experience that kingdom reality because I am here and the kingdom is now. Now, it's not fully here, right? We're not utopians. We don't think we can just build the kingdom of God ourselves. But Jesus is on this mission of yanking foretastes of the future and bringing them into reality in our time. And through our work, we get to participate in that work. So we need to inspire people. We need to say, you know what your job is about? Your job every day, whether you're that school bus driver, or whether you are that elementary school principal, or that construction supervisor, or that accountant. I really hope mine has sent mine in. I'm a little bit nervous about that. It is the 16th. Never saw it. So I, hope I'm not getting in trouble with Uncle Sam. But what is the big picture of what you get to do in your work? You get to join Jesus in his work of bringing about foretastes of the kingdom. We need to inspire people to understand that is what their work is about. It connects to how God is at work in the world. Now, once we define for them sort of this big what of their work, but then we've got to really make it real. We've got to make it three-dimensional. We've got to tell the stories. That's why it was so great that we had the panel, because then it was like 3D stories. What does this actually look like when people live it out? So I've got a few stories to share with you. So I believe that wholeness and healing is one of those kingdom foretastes. And so my first story is about this gentleman named Doug Wilson. And Doug is a fairly high-level executive at a company out in the Midwest called Hillenbrand. Now, he's not the owner of the company, and he's not the CEO of the company, but he's also not, a recent college grad at the very bottom either. He's higher up. And what Doug and some of his colleagues were able to do is come up with a really progressive, innovative solution to two problems that they were having at Hillenbrand. One was really common, which is the ever-increasing cost of healthcare. Business owners in the room know skyrocketing costs. What are we going to do about that? The second problem was that they had done a survey of their employees, and they were distressed by the fact that their employees weren't as healthy as they would have liked to have seen. Their employees sometimes were not going to the doctor when they should. They weren't always getting the medications that they should, even though the company was providing health care insurance and the like. Nevertheless, folks were not really often taking as good care of themselves as they should. And some of the reasons that they gave for that was, well, gosh, in order to go to the doctor, I got to take time off of work. I'm going to lose money. I got to go drive all the way to the doctor, sit in the office forever. When I go to get my prescriptions, my copay is $30. Sometimes I have it, sometimes I don't. And so there's these issues. So Doug and his friends at Hillenbrand talked about this, and to make a very long story short, what they were able to do was partner with a nonprofit organization whose mission it is to establish health and wellness clinics on site at different companies. And so this was not a benefit that replaced the health care insurance. This was something that the company did for their employees in addition to their health insurance. So they spent all this money and they built a health and wellness center right there at the company. They put doctors and nurses in it. It's open all the time when the factory is going, so people can have easy access to get in, see the doctor. It has a pharmacy, has a PT, it has an x-ray machine, all this kind of stuff. And they were hoping that after a couple of years, they would see some financial benefit out of this. They realized there was a big upfront cost to get it started, but they thought, maybe over time our employees will get healthier, and as they get healthier, we'll see fewer days missed in absences from work, less workman's comp, blah, 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 blah. Well, they, in the first year, came out almost $300,000 ahead. So that was a way that Doug Wilson did what I call vocational stewardship. Vocational stewardship is the intentional and strategic deployment of all the dimensions of our vocational power to advance foretastes of the kingdom of God. So Doug Wilson used his vocational power to advance a foretaste of wholeness at his company. Second story is about these three lawyers from Atlanta. These were three guys that graduated from law school. They went to work for a kind of a traditional law firm in Atlanta, and they did that for a while. And that's good work to do. I'm not in any way telling their story as like they're doing something superior. Please don't hear it that way. But these three decided that one of the questions that was important for them to ask as believers was, who benefits from the fact that I've received all this training and have all these skills? Who is benefiting from the fact that God has given me this particular vocational skill and knowledge? And who's not benefiting? And these three were very concerned that immigrants in Atlanta were not benefiting, that immigrants in Atlanta needed good legal services and didn't always have access to those services. So they pooled their resources and they bought a bus and they call it the Lawyer Mobile. And they drive it around Atlanta and they park it at ethnic churches and at Hispanic grocery store parking lots, and they go to soccer games and they go to cultural festivals, and they basically take their services out to where they're likely to engage with different immigrant families to let them know about the services that they offer. And so I think that's a great story of how these guys are trying to bring a foretaste of greater justice to a vulnerable population in their city. This is a picture of a young gal named Jill Kurtz. Jill is a fairly newly minted architect. She just graduated a couple of years ago from Kansas State with her degree in architecture, went off to San Francisco to work for an architecture firm there. And one of the things that Jill is really concerned about as a believer is the health of the planet. And Jill decided that as part of what it meant for her to integrate her faith and her work as an architect was to think about how, as an architect, she could promote the building of green buildings that are easier on the environment, that are healthy buildings. You've heard of sick building syndrome. How can we do a better job of using the right materials as we build to promote human flourishing? How can we make buildings as energy efficient as possible? So as an architect, she is advancing the kingdom value of creation care. And then finally, Nikki Heckman. Nikki is a chef in Pittsburgh, And she's an interesting story. She calls herself a younger brother type, so was kind of off there, out in the world. And she had a long range of experience in opening restaurants and bars. And some friends brought her to a church. She was probably in her mid-30s. And this church was wonderful to her. They really accepted her, and she was a seeker. And she says, they just sort of put up with me and all my questions for about 4 or 5 years as I was wrestling as that younger brother, not wanting to kind of give it all up, and finally sort of devoted her life to Christ. Well, then she did what a lot of converts do. She thought, oh, well, now I'm a Christian. I guess I now got to go get like a spiritual job. So I guess maybe I better go to seminary, or I should help out with the church youth ministry or whatever. And so she kind of began moving in that direction, but she wasn't really all that excited about it. And thankfully, the pastor sort of took her aside one day, and he said, Nikki, God's given you amazing gifts as a chef. Just because you're now a Christian doesn't mean you don't get to be a chef anymore. She's like, oh, that's such good news. I really want to be a chef. And so Nikki's done a lot of really great things. One of the things she's done is open this restaurant in the neighborhood where the church is located, which is a sort of a transitional, economically distressed neighborhood called Northside in Pittsburgh. It's a neighborhood where the church deliberately put itself and deliberately stayed there to try to be an agent of community renewal in that particular neighborhood. And so Nikki took some real risks as an entrepreneur. To open up a restaurant in an area of town that some people feel is a little sketchy, to open a restaurant in an area of town where there wasn't a lot of parking. I mean, this was a faith venture. But she thought, I want to be an agent of economic renewal in this distressed community. I want to create jobs. I want to create a restaurant where people will be able to come in and they'll be able to eat for an affordable price, but eat really healthy food. So she's opened Bistro to Go, and she really sees herself as one who's been called to really bless her neighborhood. She's created over 46 jobs between this restaurant and a second one that she has started. She offers free cooking classes to the moms in the community to teach them how to cook nutritionally on a low budget. She's really got a great gift of evangelism. She deliberately designed the architecture of Bistro to Go to be a very open space. She says, I want people to see me in my kitchen interacting with them and with my staff, because they need to sort of see the good, bad, and the ugly of me as a follower of Jesus, because everybody knows I'm a follower of Jesus, because I just tell people about that. And she just wants to be authentic and real. And so she even designed the very physical structure of what the bistro looks like to really be a metaphor of that. So we need to tell these sorts of stories of how people are using their vocational power to advance these fortes. And I think that the 4 stories that I've told, the stories that Doug mentioned, the stories you heard from the panel, I think those stories are sitting in your pews. And you need to find them, and you need to showcase them and give people an opportunity to tell them. All right? So in terms of implementation on this point about inspiration, the task of inspiration, one of the really practical things that we just need to do is identify those stories and give them some upfront time. Make a little video, a little 2 or 3 minute video out of them, or bring them up on a Sunday morning and have them share with the congregation, what are the kingdom fortes that you have opportunities to advance in your profession? And tell us and describe for us what that has looked like. You see, I think these testimonies need to have kind of at least 2 parts to them, and maybe Doug's presentation and mine can kind of fit together as 2 horses pulling a cart or something. Part of the congregant testimony is to basically sort of talk about your relationships, so they can stand up and talk about their witness in the workplace. They can talk about how they're sharing Christ in really winsome ways with people. They can talk about how they are trying to be a person of integrity and responsibility, those values that Mike talked about. How they are functionally relying on Christ, like Eileen was telling us about. I just love that picture of her sitting in that red chair every morning for an hour, so aware that what Jesus said in John 15 actually is true when he said, hello, I'm the vine, you're the branch. Apart from me, you can do what? Something? A little bit of something? A lot? No, you can do nothing. And Eileen really gets that. What a beautiful testimony. So we need those sorts of testimonies of those sort of relational and individual things. But we also need these kind of testimonies, these testimonies that speak about the nature of the work itself, right? So we need to hear of people talking about how they're advancing these kingdom fortes through their work. A second thing that some churches are trying around the country, I have the great privilege of working with a couple other gentlemen, and we have this learning community. It's called the Vocation Infusion Learning Community. It's a cohort of 15 churches from around the country that have decided to partner with us on a year-long journey. And in the learning community, what we're really talking about is how to flesh this out, how to make it real. And each of these churches is actually working together over the course of several months on filling out what we're calling a vocation infusion plan, so that this notion of vocational stewardship can mark the DNA all throughout the church, not some little siloed activity over here like, oh, went to a conference on faith and work, I guess we should have like a 6-week sermon series on that, and poof, they'll do it, and it won't be, as Doug said, sustainable, right? So we've got this notion of this vocation infusion. Infuse this stuff all through your congregation. And so we're hearing them tell stories about what are some of the practical things that they're doing. Well, one of the practical things some of them are doing is beginning to gather people together by their vocational field of interest, whether that's in a vocational guild or a vocational small group, or even something as simple as a vocational dinner. You know, identify a lawyer, identify a finance person, identify a marketing person, identify an artist, identify a person in the trades, and say to them, what about hosting a little gathering in your home where you get together with other Christian bankers and accountants and lawyers and whatever, and just get together, and what if over dinner we talked about how our work in this vocational sphere participates in God's ongoing sustaining and provision for the creation? Or if we talked about how does our work in this vocational sphere participate in God's gracious work of restraining evil and corruption in the world? Or how does our work in this vocational sphere participate in God's redemption and renewal of all things? These kind of vocational dinners can just begin to prime the pump of those sorts of conversations and help people really get inspired about what they can do. So that's the first task. Our second task is what I would call the task of discovery. Earlier, I defined vocational stewardship as the strategic and intentional deployment of all the dimensions of our vocational power to advance fortes of the kingdom of God. Well, embedded in that rather long definition is that phrase, the dimensions of their vocational power. People will not steward well that which they do not recognize they possess. People cannot and will not steward well that which they do not recognize they possess. So we need to help people sort of discover just how much vocational power they actually possess. And one of the things that's been really interesting to me as I've been kind of in this world the last 3-4 years is how regularly I'm meeting marketplace folks who basically feel like they don't have any vocational power. And it takes a while for me to work with them and sort of draw it out and help them understand that they do. The first part of this is what I would call the dimensions of vocational power. We need to help people understand that they have, you know, we've heard about a couple of these already. Doug was telling us about this business of influence. He says the average worker, you know, has a sphere of influence of 25 to 50 other people in their workplace that they can, they can persuade. I think about platform. I think about, was it Susan? Is that the name of the nurse on the panel? You know, she has had a platform. She was there in Washington, D.C. She was there at conferences internationally. And she uses that platform to speak about how to sort of bring a godly perspective into nursing. People have different positions that they can use, whether they're at the top of their company, or they may have a lesser level position but still be able to use it. So let's tell some stories about what this looks like, because again, first we sort of tell people what it is, and then we want to give them some pictures of it. So this is a story about a young man named Tim Schultz, and Tim is a guy that went to a trade school in Fresno, became a carpenter. And for 7 years, Tim has been working for a local builder in Fresno. So he is, again, he's not the top of his company. He has a relatively modest job. He doesn't have a huge amount of seniority. He's got 7 years on the job. But one of the things that Tim did, he recognized in his company that, and I'm oversimplifying here for the point of being quick, because I really want to more have Q&A and discussion time. But basically in the construction industry, a lot of times his company went in and they like knock down a building and then they like build a new building. That's kind of what you do. You knock them down and you build them up. And in between, they were paying all this money for a hauler to come in and pick up all the construction waste and drag it away to a landfill. And Tim thought, there just has to be a better way. Like, it seems like an awful lot of stuff is going into the landfill, and that's not really great for the creation. And so he just went to his employer and he said, look, how about if my friends and I, who have some skill in carpentry, would you allow us to sort of salvage through some of this construction waste and bring it to our homes and see what we can make out of it instead of it all having to go to the landfill? Well, the company owner thought that was a great idea because he has to pay per pound or something like that by hauling this stuff away. So Tim uses his skills to take construction waste and make it into recycled furniture. I love that. He's participating in the renewal of all things. He's taking garbage and he's making it something really useful. And he's doing that by using the dimension of his vocational power known as his skills. The gal in the car there is Wendy Clark. When Wendy was 20 years old, she dropped out of college. She was a business major. She dropped out of school because she was like, okay, I think I've learned enough. I just want to go start a business. I don't want to keep talking about it. I want to go out and do it. And Wendy really had a vision for wanting to create a business that would create jobs for single moms. She just really, really, really had a heart for single moms. And so she decided to start this Carpe Diem cleaning business. And because she's the owner of the company, she gets to kind of make the rules. And what Wendy has really tried hard to do is use her position as a business owner to create really flexible work situations for these moms, so they're really able to balance their duties as a mom and picking kids up after school and the like, as well as doing the work. And that's a real blessing to her employees. Now, she can't stay in business if she doesn't make a profit. So she couldn't just decide, I think I want to start a business to bless single moms. I'll pay them $70,000 to clean houses. Won't that be great? It'll be such a blessing to them. Obviously, that's not a business model that's going to work. She pays them the market rate as much as she can, afford to do that. But she knows it's not a real high salary. So one of the creative things she's done is she's engaged in a partnership with the local food bank, whereby she makes a corporate contribution, and in return she gets these vouchers, and so her employees get their monthly paycheck and they get a voucher worth a week's worth of groceries. So she's trying to stretch the household budgets of her employees. She also has done a neat thing in terms of the training. Every year she has her team come together and they have a training time, but rather than doing it in their little office in Durham, North Carolina, she's used her networks to identify this Christian retreat center that's owned by some friends of hers, and she basically has the moms bring their kids to this Christian, it's almost like a camp. And so while the moms are there for the weekend getting their training, the kids are getting to go canoeing and climbing trees and romping around and having a lot of fun, and it's a way of them being able to have a little family vacation that otherwise they probably wouldn't be able to afford. So this is just a woman who's so thinking, so creatively, deploying her positional power as the head of her little company. How can I really be blessing these employees in my company? And then a story about platform. I love this story. Unfortunately, I don't have a name because this was a story. Did I hear this story through you, Jesse? I heard a story. This is a story I heard from a friend of a friend. It might have been Jesse's colleague, Eric Marsh. Anyway, the basic story was there's this young man, graduates, maybe he was from Biola, I don't know, he was from somewhere out here in the West Coast, graduates as an accountant, gets his certification, and he gets hired by one of these really big accounting firms. I don't know which one it was, but it was one of the really big ones. So there he is. He's, fresh out of college, and he's living in cubicle land, right? And people in cubicle land think they have no vocational power whatsoever, and you try to have this conversation with them, and their eyes sort of glaze over, and they don't really understand what you're talking about. But, Bob was able to, and I'm sorry, I just had to call him Bob in case anybody asks the question, what about Bob? Yeah, thanks. Thanks for getting that. I knew the Long Beach table would give me a signal on that. So Bob's sitting there in cubicle land doing his accounting thing, and one day this email comes around from the big corporation inviting employees to volunteer for this committee that has to do with the charitable giving of the corporation. And he sort of hears other people, and they're kind of groaning and moaning about it. I don't know if it was Monday, and so they were doing one of their 10 minutes or 16 minutes of moaning or whatever. But everyone's grouching, and they don't want to have to serve on this committee, and it's just more time and hassle and whatever. And meanwhile, Bob's sitting there thinking, well, I think that'd be kind of cool. So he decides he'll go to the meeting. Well, you know how these sort of stories go. By the end of the meeting, Bob has been elected the chairman of the committee. So here's Bob living in cubicle land. He's now the chairman of the corporate giving committee of his branch of, Accenture or whatever the name of the big, accounting firm was. Well, he had a platform at that point, and he used it well. He really mobilized a lot of, particularly a lot of the other people in cubicle land, to get really excited about saying, our company talks about being a good corporate citizen, but let's really get some teeth to that, And he started getting people really jazzed up about raising more money. And then he went to the higher ups in HR and he said, what if the corporation's charitable giving thing wasn't just the giving of money, but what if it was the giving of us? Like, what if we could actually go out into the community and serve and have like a community service day or whatever? And Bob started making these changes, and he ended up really influencing and shaping the culture at this large accounting firm, even though he was just in cubicle land. So we have to help people discover that they really do have some vocational power. So some practical implementation ideas with regard to this. Well, the first one is, we need to actually capture some vocational demographics in our congregations. Doug spoke of commissioning people. We can't commission all the lawyers if we don't actually know who all the lawyers are, right? So think about the fact that your church has a database. You have to collect information. You ask people for their name and their address and their phone number. People fill out little welcome cards when they join your new members class. They probably fill out some sort of thing. Maybe in your church every few years you produce one of those little directories of, pictures of people or whatever. As you do this information collecting, how hard is it, guys, to add a few fields in the database to ask people about their occupations? So you could actually begin. This facilitates something like vocationally based small groups or these vocational dinners. We have to know who these people are. So we need to take just some time administratively to capture this information. Secondly, we need to think about not just doing spiritual gifts inventories. I have nothing against spiritual gifts inventories, but we are more than our spiritual gifts, folks. We are also our natural gifts. And the shape thing is so much better because it captures not just your spiritual gifts, but your abilities, your passions, your aptitudes, your life experiences. We need to really think about enhancing our spiritual gifts inventories and classes and trainings to be much broader so that we're really inventorying all the different types of talents that people have. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to have a slide up on the screen that will give you the web address of one of my websites called vocationalstewardship.org. And you'll be able to go on there and actually download a little form that you could use if you wanted to for one of these sort of talent inventories. And then a third idea, and I have to, in the interest of fairness, I have to admit that although I've suggested this, as far as I know, there's not a single church that has ever actually done this. But I'm just going to keep beating this drum, and someday somebody's going to do it. But what I would call an influence audit. I came to this conversation about sort of faith and work through a different doorway than a lot of people. A lot of people come to this like Doug, up in the business, world. And kind of through the marketplace ministry. Well, I'm not a business person. I've been working for the nonprofit sector my whole life. But what I'm really, really passionate about is community transformation. I'm really passionate about God's people being used by Him in this work of renewing all things and bringing shalom and justice and human flourishing to communities. And I have to tell you, in order to bring that kind of profound and robust community transformation, it ain't going to happen when all we're doing is little food banks and little commodities and little let's write a check for somebody's rent or whatever. It's not going to cut it, folks. We've got to fundamentally start changing some of the systems. We've got to address some of the structural issues that keep people in oppression and in poverty. We need to create jobs. We need to create wealth. We need to change the education system. There's all these really big tasks that need to happen in our society if our communities are going to become ever more healthy. And in order to make those kinds of changes, people of influence need to start using their influence in ways that promote the power to change those things. So one day I was just sort of sitting in the pew at my church. I go to a church of about 1,500. It's largely a kind of white, middle class, some upper middle class people. And I was just like looking around and I was thinking, oh my gosh, there is so much influence sitting in this room. And we haven't really leveraged it because we don't even really know it's there. I mean, for all we know, like the best friend of the school superintendent could be sitting in pew number 13. And the cousin of the mayor could be sitting in the back of the church. And the choir director's neighbor, is the local police chief. And on and on and on the stories go. So we have people of influence in our congregations, and we have people who are only separated from people of influence by a few degrees. And we actually need to figure out who all these people are if we really want to begin to seriously talk about our role in seeing the church deployed in bringing change. So again, there's a tool on my website for this influence audit type thing. All right, we've talked about the task of inspiration. We got to get people to understand that God is on a mission, and in your work you get to join Him in that mission and tell those stories of how people are advancing foretastes of the kingdom. We got to help people with this task of discovery so that they actually understand whether they're the CEO or the janitor. They actually do have vocational power and influence and talent and skill and platform and position. And they just need to understand it. Why? Because you can't steward well that which you don't recognize you have. Third, we need to do the task of formation. Once we've got people all gung-ho about what they can do through their work, and we've helped them to see that they've actually got some power, now they've got to become the kind of people that have this sort of heart so that they don't misuse that power and that influence and that position. They have to become the kind of people that Jesus will trust with His power. And they need to learn how to use their vocational power in such a way that it imitates the way that Christ uses His power. Now, there's many things that we could say about formation. I'm just going to say one, which is part of the task of formation is helping our congregants to learn what it looks like to share power like Jesus did. And I've got two stories about that. And the first one is a sort of a story of somebody with lots of power, and the second one is a story about someone with little power. This is a picture of a guy named Rich Dean. He's a senior partner at a large Washington, D.C. based law firm. So he is at the top of his career. He's a partner. And once you've kind of gotten up the ladder in a law firm, When you're the partner, that means that as new cases kind of come into the firm, you get to pick and choose which ones. You get to pick the really cool cases, the really sexy cases, the really intellectually interesting cases, the cases that will further hone your intellectual development, the cases that will get you noticed, the cases that the media will be caring about. When you're at the top, you have the power to be able to pick those. But you know what Rich does? Rich typically declines to take those ones, and he gives those really wonderful cases to the next layer down, what's called the associates in the firm. And it is such an incredibly countercultural thing to do in the world of law that these young associates don't even they're just kind of like, blah, blah, what? And eventually they get around to asking him, why is he doing that? And so Rich Dean has taken God knows how many young lawyers to lunch and told them about Jesus. Because he shares power like Jesus, and that has really led to interest in Jesus. Not only that, but Rich is really trying to sort of mentor and professionally groom and develop these lawyers so that they will be the best lawyers they can be by allowing them to work on these really difficult cases and the ones that can really hone their skills. Well, I told that story about Rich Dean in the hearing of a young friend of mine named Kendall, who I don't have a picture of, but I made a cool little word cloud. Just learned how to do that whole word cloud thing, and now I'm like it's like every day I'm like, ooh, I think I'll make a word cloud. So her name is Kendall, and Kendall doesn't even have a job yet, okay? But Kendall is finishing up her semester this year in nursing school. And when you get to this point in nursing school, you're not in the classroom as much, you're actually out on the hospital floor, and you're kind of really learning what it's like to be a nurse. And she heard that story about Rich Dean and how he shares power. And I could see the wheels sort of beginning to turn in her mind. And she said, Amy, I was thinking, one of the things I've really noticed being in the hospital, when you're there during the shift change, so the nurses have been on the day shift and now they're coming off and the night shift nurses are coming in, there's this whole negotiation that goes on during that shift change where the nurses that have been there start talking about, the grouch is down in room 13B, the lady with hepatitis, she's a real grouch, and then there's a sweet man, the sweet guy with such and such in room 12A and whatever. And basically you go through, and who's the good patients? And who are the patients with, mother from hell and, family out the wazoo and whatever. And all the nurses kind of, try to get the good patients. And Kendall says, I was thinking when you were talking about that story about Rich Dean, and I was thinking, I'm not going to be a powerful person when I'm a new nurse on the floor. I don't really have any power. But she said, but then I was thinking, but what if during that time, I offer to take the patients that nobody else wants. Because that would be a way of sort of sharing, with my fellow nurses. And plus, those grouchy patients, I think, as a Christian, maybe I could help them more because Jesus is going to really help me. He's going to give me Holy Spirit power to help me with the grouchy patients. And I just looked at her and I said, I love you, Kendall. I just love you. You are so awesome. What a wonderful thing. Even this young woman, but she's a woman of such mature faith. She's the kind of person that Jesus actually trusts with his power because she knows what to do with it. She knows how to deploy it in a way that really imitates the way that Jesus uses power. So what are some practical implementation steps when it comes to this? Well, I think one very simple one is this: to figure out places, whether it's in a sermon, whether it's in an adult education class, where can you suggest to your congregants that they take up this question? How and where can I make room for the talents and creativity of others with whom I work? Just as God has graciously made room for me by allowing me to participate in his work. I think when we ask those kinds of questions and get people really thinking about that, what that helps them do is begin to form themselves into the character of Christ in the workplace. So inspiration, discovery, and formation All right, 3 tasks. Let's go ahead and have some good time of Q&A and discussion. Love to hear any stories that any of you guys are doing, trying out things on any of those sort of 3 tasks, or questions that you have about them.
But you know what? One of the things that just jumped out at me is a pattern or as a theme, and you mentioned expressly, but I just want to accent it, that I think those in the marketplace, as well as clergy who are perhaps trying to tend to people in the marketplace with refreshed attention that we're talking about today, we put people in power buckets, that you're either the big wig, the big cheese in the corner office, or you're lost in the murky middle, or you're at the bottom. And the reality is we all have a sphere of influence.
Right.
We all have a sphere of influence, whether large or small, even if it's just the coworker that maybe Phil helps minister to me today because he sees I'm a bit blue. So I like that was embedded in all your stories, and while we like the big game-changing, paradigm-changing stories, those little ones matter just as much. So
Right.
I just want to kind of affirm that thread of your talk.
Thank you. This is the slide, by the way, for the vocationalstewardship.org. Just go on there and click on the resources section, and you'll get to some of those things, including discussion guides for vocationally based groups and those vocational dinners, that kind of thing. Thank you, David. Other comments and questions?
How would you talk to people in your congregation who are unemployed? We talked about the retired, so we talked a bit about that, but people who are in transition, students, and you kind of gave an example, but speak more about that.
Yeah. This is actually an interesting conversation we had at our last learning community retreat. We had one of our small groups try to kind of wrestle with this whole question. There you are, inspiring people, and you got people sitting there, I don't have a job. So, I think there's a few things. When it comes to sort of students, obviously you can basically reframe this to say this is your job. Your workplace is the school, and a really important part of that ministry is what Mark was talking about, which is that relational, there I am, and my fellow students are a mission field, and I can be sharing Christ with them. So getting that aspect of it, but also really helping the students, again, to think about the nature of their work itself, which is their studies. How do they think about their studies? How can they begin to understand, what they're learning in history or what they're learning in economics, and begin to process that through a Christian worldview? So they're beginning, to really do the hard work of thinking even about the things that they're learning. I would hate for us to reduce the notion that ministry is just sort of verbal evangelism. I think verbal evangelism is a really important part of it, but there's more to it than just that. So that's what I would say for students, as well as for sort of everybody else that's out there that is doing non-remunerated work, right? Everything that I've said, and usually I actually tell a story about a stay-at-home mom, and I can tell that if you want me to tell it because it's a cool story. But, when we're talking about this faith and work conversation, we don't want to leave out all the people who, we don't want to define work only as people that literally go off somewhere and they get paid to do that work. Because lots and lots of people are doing really important work if we define work as being contribution. And my goodness, the stay-at-home mom, the stay-at-home dad is making a massively, massively important contribution. So we want to be careful about how we talk about these things. But those who are in those non-remunerated positions, it's the same conversation. I still have influence as a volunteer. I still have a platform. I still have skills that I'm honing. And how can I use all of that to advance Kingdom Fortes? Now, to get to your specific question, which is what do I do about these sort of unemployed people? Part of it is I think you lament with them. That's really important. We have to recognize what a huge grief this really is. Basically the church, I think we kind of stink at grief, honestly, all the different kinds of griefs, and we really need to get better at it. And we need to help people grieve and lament. Secondly, I think it's a great opportunity for the church to really try to come alongside these people in that whole discovery part of it, to really talk to them about the job that they lost. Was it one that they loved, one that they were indifferent to? Is it possible that this hard circumstance has come about because God is transitioning them? Are they supposed to be in this time of unemployment, is this a time for them to be kind of asking some of those discovery questions about how have I, looking back, how have I deployed the person God made me, the skills that He's given me, the interests that I have, the things I'm really passionate about? Maybe, I mean, there's many reasons why people don't have a job, a zillion reasons why they don't have a job, but at least one could be that the Lord is providing them with an opportunity to move into a different kind of job that will better utilize who He made them to be. So I think to recognize that all of these tasks, and particularly the task of discovery, is still relevant to the person without a job. But you just want to do that as a secondary thing after you first do the really important work of just sitting with the person and saying, wow, I feel your pain. Like, this is really, really hard. Not to mention that, maybe we need to do better too. I mean, I know of examples of churches, not very many of them, but a few of them, who literally, because of unemployed people, they've done specific things, like bring in a career counselor, like do workshops at the church to help people like do their resume and practice job interviews, like bringing business people together. We had an amazing guy on one of our webinars for the vocational learning community, and he told a story. He's now a college president, but he used to be a senior pastor of a church in Kansas. And back in the 80s, I guess it was, there was some hard things going on in the regional economy, and there was a lot of unemployed people in his church. So he rounded up a whole bunch of business guys who were kind of entrepreneurially minded, and he got them together and he said, look, you guys need to like come up with something because we need to start some stuff to hire these people. And they did. They like actually invented 2 new businesses, and they began putting people to work. So it's like, hello, like that's a pretty cool thing for the church to be involved in doing. And again, some of the less sexy things that I talked about earlier, like capturing these vocational demographics, like you have to have that in place. There's probably really good career counselors sitting in your pews, and they need to be connected to the people that don't have jobs in your pews so that they can provide them with these good listening conversations to really figure out, how has God made you and wired you, and how can I help you, find your way. So I think we have a lot more to offer our unemployed people than we think we do. We just need to be way more intentional about it. Okay, all right. So the story about the stay-at-home mom is a woman named Angela Baker, and Angela and her family live in Portland. She's a stay-at-home mom, 4 kids, homeschools them all. Dad is a high school history teacher at a local public school. So they're on one income, not a lot of money, living in a small apartment. One of the kids has all this dental problem, I don't know what happened, and has to go to the dentist, money, and they get in debt. Got to pay off the dentist. And so they turn to this local ministry, really, really wonderful local ministry called BCS Community Services. Do you all have that store here called Costco? Or, yeah, you got a Costco, so good. We don't have one. Wish we did, but we don't have one. So BCS Community Services, basically it's a ministry where they have this Costco-like building with all this groceries and household stuff in it that they've gleaned, and corporations have made donations and individuals have made donations. And so there's just all this stuff, food, groceries, Tide, whatever. And the way that it works is that people that qualify as the working poor pay $50 a month to join the BCS, and they give some sweat equity labor to help run the actual thing and go around and collect the donations and whatever. And then for that $50 and those few hours each month of labor, they get the equivalent of about $500 a month worth of groceries and goods. So as a result, the bakers, by being members of BCS Community Services, they stretched their household budget to the point where they were able to pay off their debt to the dentist, and even began putting a little bit of money aside. And they got to a point where they had a little nest egg, and they were ready to purchase their first home. And they were so excited because she's a gardener, and they were going to have a lawn, and the kids were all excited, and everything was great. And so they're poised to like move into their new little bungalow. And they get this email from BCS Community Services. It's like this alert, urgent, help, prayer. One of the two community gardens in Portland that had been supplying them with the produce for the Costco-like place was going to be shut down. And they were really rallying. They were like, we really have to do something about this. We need prayer. We don't know. We're only going to have half as much produce as before. Well, you know what Angela Baker did? She sits down with the family and she says, BCS has been so good to our family. Like, we wouldn't even be moving into our new house if we didn't have them. And the family decided that they would give their lawn. And I have this awesome picture. It's like the before and after. And it's like their front lawn and their back lawn and the little side lawn. They made it all into one big community garden. And she's a gardener. I mean, she's really skilled at that. And so now the BCS sweat equity labor workers come in and they work in the garden. She teaches them how to garden. She teaches them how to do their own little gardens at home. And now her house and her lawn is providing a bunch of the produce for BCS Community Services. And I love that story because I love the fact that, that email came around and it's not like the bakers sat there and said, oh, well, we can't write a big check. We don't have a lot of money. They thought about what are the assets that we do have that we could steward for the common good. And they gave what they had, and what they had was their lawn. That's what they could give, and so that's what they gave. I love that story.
I have a different kind of question. I don't know if how you would address this, but how would you advance vocational stewardship within the family? Let me give you my thoughts because currently I'm teaching an adult education class on faith and work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've asked the attendees to do is to write a vocational biography and to talk about what they've learned about work from their family, from their parents, from their culture. And I've realized that a lot of my views about work and the meaning of work was derived from my parents' example, what I saw them value. Yeah. So as we have so many young families in our church who their investment is their children. Yeah. They want their children to succeed. How can we begin to nurture a sense of vocational stewardship for the parents so that they can build a proper foundation for their children?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for sharing it. Couple of answers. One is I'd love to suggest a book. It's called The Missional Mom. The Missional Mom. So came out last year from IVP. I can't think of the name of the author right off the top of my head. Helen Lee, yeah. Anyway, that's just a great book talking to moms about the vocation of parenting and about doing it in a way that the whole family understands that their life is on mission with God. So I guess the simple way I would answer your question is to say the family should see its life as being rooted in Christ, and the family is on mission in the Missio Dei in the kingdom. Just like when dad goes off to work or mom goes off to work or kids go off to school, they're participating in the mission of God. The family is participating in the mission of God. So I think that can practically look like a number of things. It can look like kids actually coming and visiting mom and dad at their workplaces, and kids beginning to have a little bit more of an understanding of like, what do mommy and daddy do when they are at work, and why do they do that, and having the parents really explain to their kids how they would articulate what it looks like for them to be a Christian artist. How they could say to their kid, well, the reason I'm doing this is because God really cares about beauty and dignity, and there are people in the world that are made in the image of God, and they don't see that, and I'm doing this work to help them really understand that. So they can sort of shepherd and bring their kids along with them to work. I think they can model, what are we modeling? Are we modeling workaholism? Are we modeling Monday morning groaning? Like, what are we modeling? As workers, are we modeling, are we modeling like the appropriate biblical view that work is wonderful, it is normative, it is part of paradise, we're going to be doing it for the rest of our lives because it doesn't go away in the new heaven and the new earth? And work is right now hard and toilsome and often futile and often annoying and often difficult. So how, can they really model that really, really well? Can they find ways of talking about what they're doing in their work that is appropriately optimistic and realistic. You know, I was having a good conversation at my table, and we were talking about sort of this world-changing language. And some of it, I mean, I use it, we all use it, you know, and some of it is fine because it's sort of inspirational, you know, Biola students, you know, go change the world. But on the other hand, it can, some of that can actually be sort of harmful, because then we sort of set people up to think like they've got to do some humongous thing, and then they can't do this humongous thing because they're sitting in cubicle land, and then they think, you know, I think that's one of the reasons they switch off the switch. You know, he's talking about turning off the God switch. Was like, you know, if the choice is like, you know, change the world, you know, and here's a story about, you know, this $40 billion CEO company and how he's changing the world, but, you know, I'm sitting there in cubicle land. It's like, well, I guess I can't do that. So how do we model to our particularly our older kids, you know, when they're in high school and the like, how do, on the one hand, do we say those wonderful, optimistic, you know, God's given you so many talents and you can do, you know, you can do anything, and God's going to do, you know, God has a plan for you and he's going to do great things for your life, and honestly do that sort of thing, while also sort of saying, but you know what, honey, you know, the first job you go to, like, don't go into the interview thinking that you're like God's gift to them, and that your job is just going to be one endless source of personal satisfaction and meaning and reward, because it's not. Because you're going to have to pay your dues for a long time, you know? So there's teaching about the nature of work, I think, that we have to do in the family. So those would be several ideas.
Are there any things that you've seen pastors do in terms of, you know, I know Sunday morning's not everything, but regular theology that they talk about, or even the ways that they spend their time, that leads to the kind of innovation and, you know, engagement that you're talking about?
Yeah, I can actually answer that fairly definitively, but keep in mind that my sample size is limited, okay? So I want to make a really strong statement, and I also want to have a caveat, the fact that I'm basing it on a relatively few number of cases. But when it comes to the churches in our learning community, and when it comes to the churches that I've discovered kind of around the country that really get this and are sustaining it, and so you put all those together, and maybe we're talking about like 40 churches, or so, small sample. The common thing that I see head and shoulders above everything is that they preach a big gospel. That they preach the big story of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. They preach what people have been calling the 4-chapter gospel, which has the 2-chapter gospel embedded in it. The 2-chapter gospel, meaning Genesis 3 to Revelation 20. Remember, the Bible doesn't start with Genesis 3, the fall, and end with Genesis 20, the judgment. That's a bad news to bad news story. We've got good news. Starts with Genesis 1, as my friend Andy Crouch says, and it goes, you know, to the end of Revelation. It's a good news to good news story. If we only talk about the mission of Jesus in the world as the sort of, what's that fancy theological word, soteriology? How to pronounce it? Thank you. I mean, now don't get me wrong. Don't like go home and say, I can't believe this liberal girl they had at Biola. Oh my gosh, like she wasn't talking about the gospel. Like, no, I get it. Okay, I get it. I believe it. Thank God. I need a Savior every day, every minute. Okay? But that is part of the larger story. Okay? The world did not begin with the fall. The world began with creation and human vocation and human dignity and intimacy with God. And it's going to end with a resurrected paradise. And in between, there is this work of redemption of all things, and what was lost in the fall was not just our relationship with God. Yes, we lost our relationship with God in the fall, and that was absolutely tragic. But we lost 4 things in the fall. We lost peace with self, peace with God, peace with the creation, and peace with one another. And we do not, in my opinion, we do not provide Christ all of the glory that he deserves. if we reduce the work of the cross to only a work of spiritual salvation, as though the only thing Jesus' death accomplished was to get us right with God. It did accomplish that, and thank God that it did. And do not hear me, please, as saying anything less than that. I don't want to say anything ever less than that. But the atonement story is more than that. And the power of the cross is more than that. And the work of God in the world is more than that. It's a story of all of shalom being renewed and redone. And that theology is critical. Because if you don't have the 4 chapters, what goes on in the world just really doesn't matter that much. And if what goes on in the world doesn't, if creation doesn't matter that much, and if it's all just going to burn up in the end and we're all just floating around as disembodied souls playing on harps, on chords, on clouds, then all this work we're doing doesn't really matter. How are you going to persuade people that what you actually do in your job matters if the world doesn't matter, if creation doesn't matter, if God's work of renewing all things doesn't matter, if the only thing that matters are souls, then your work doesn't really matter except to make sure you're in there, evangelizing as much as you possibly can. So I think it gets sustained when you have a really orthodox, full Bible, creation, fall, redemption, consummation theology. Because that's what really gets people excited about living for Christ in all these full dimensions.
One I saw in an English-speaking church in Bonn, Germany. When you leave the church and you're going out, it's sort of an old-fashioned, kind of looks almost like a New England church, even though it's in Germany. And you go out and there's the sort of the balcony above and the organ and above. But over the door that leads out to the out of doors, it says servants entrance. Mm-hmm. So when you're leaving the church, it says servants entrance. It costs about $1.95 to make a sign like that to put below all your doors. So that's one thought. And the other was a church, a mega church in Leawood, Kansas, that was doing a series on faith and work, and the pastor was doing sort of a 4-part series. And there's a place for that. I recognize your point about sustainability, but sometimes you jumpstart something with a little attention. And he took the front of the sanctuary, and this might be sacrilegious to some people, but he took the front of the sanctuary, took out his pulpit. He had one of these, big, stunning, gorgeous, modern pulpits. Took it out, and he put a workplace cubicle there instead. And for 4 Sundays, he preached from that cubicle, and that sat there also during the whole week, so when people came in and out. Talk about like a visual message to people. So I just share those two. If you have flexibility in your architecture and space, that's cheap, creative solutions.
Thank you, Amy, for the inspiration, for the reminder of the bigger kingdom and what we're about, and centering that on Jesus and following Jesus. I think there's a question in this somewhat by way of confession. You gave us a charge of, becoming the kind of people who have a heart, become the kind of people who trust Jesus with his power. That's not always easy for some of us in church leadership. I'll say somewhat facetiously. What if I feel like the times I struggle with it, I don't have the heart to give away the power for people to experience that? Maybe one example, 10 or 15 minutes in an interview and testimonies when I've got great things to teach, redesigning how we program things, or the flip side of that, Amy, to sustain this. We also feel tremendous burdens that if it doesn't have sustainability, it won't last. So I think I'm carrying the kingdom on my shoulders for the sake of Jesus. So it's a two-sided question where I get lost in the whole power thing that I'm not very good at. Can you help me kind of through the storm there?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I really appreciate the authenticity of laying that out on the table, because that's just a reality. And so I would think every other pastor is sitting here somewhere in their heart, nodding agreement. So this is not easy. Some of the pastors that I interviewed talked about this very thing. Doug Spada was talking about, gotta have the launching pad, the whole idea, release your people, go out in the world and do their stuff. And these pastors were really honest with me, and they said, that's really scary for us. Like, how's all the work of the church going to get done? Like, who's going to be running my Sunday school class, and who's going to help with this and that and the other? You know, if everybody's released and like there's no planes left, you know? Like, who's going to clean the bathrooms on the aircraft carrier, you know? All the planes are gone. So I really appreciated that, you know, that they were really open about that. And what was really neat was that, I'll just tell you what they told me, which was, as they trusted the Lord more and more, that this really was the right vision and that they really were called to this task of equipping the saints, and that they needed to give them the freedom to do work outside of the four walls of the church. What they discovered was that as they just sort of gave people the freedom to use their gifts, to discover where their places for service really were, that there were, in fact, people who felt like they did want to serve in those roles within the church. Partly because sometimes, in my book, I talk about these 4 pathways, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically what I say is, on pathway 1 is what I call bloom where you're planted, which is do this vocational stewardship thing at the job you get up and go to every day during the week. But the reality for some people is it's very difficult to do that it's hard for them to do sort of vocational stewardship in the job they currently have. Partly because they might be in a job that isn't their vocation. So really what they are is a dancer, but they're waiting tables, you know, or really what they are is a graphic designer, but they're, you know, doing something else. And so there's got to be sort of other pathways for expressing this notion of vocational stewardship, and one of those pathways I call donate your skills. And so these pastors, what they basically testified to me was that as they, you know, went before God and said, my hands are like this, I'm holding on because I'm afraid. And as they opened up and said, you know, I'm giving you my people, and I'm trusting you, they found that there was plenty of people that sort of went out and was, you know, doing great things, and yet everything that needed to happen within the walls still got done too that was important to be done. And that was a real faith builder, you know, for them. In some instances, pastors that I've talked to have had to have some really hard conversations with themselves and the rest of their leadership to ask about some of the activities inside the 4 walls. And did some of those activities really, maybe they were good, but were they the best? When they created a competition so that the parishioner had to decide whether I was going to do this thing outside or whether I was going to come to this meeting on the inside, we're all finite creatures, and there's only 24 hours in a day. So some of them had to decide, you know, we've put too much emphasis on all these programs and stuff we're doing inside the church, and we need to, like, notch it back a little bit so that people have time to be engaged on this mission in the world. So those were the responses I heard, was that the people had to really trust the Lord to be those sort of release, having those hands of release, believing that he would accomplish what needed to get done, and also even holding loosely to the activities within the 4 walls to say, Lord, you know, which of these belong to you and which of these are really critical for the equipping of your people and the inspiring of your people, and which of them just are not. You know, which of them, you know, do I just need to kind of give up? Maybe there are things that make me feel like, wow, my church is so cool because we have this thing, this program. But my pride's pretty much it's not really about God's glory anymore. It's kind of become about our reputation as a church because we have this cool program. So I think it's a hard thing, but I think it's a real prayerful talk with Jesus about it kind of thing.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.